Okay, so what I'd like to do now is to talk about innovation from the point of view of this notion of degrees and dimensions of innovation, just to clarify that. So an easy starting point is to talk about degrees of innovation, and I think possibly the best way to think of this is the amount of innovation that is happening over time. And let's think about it in terms of change. How much change is actually going on? And it's, for the most part, there's kind of a trajectory of change that happens in an organization over a number of years that people are accustomed to. And they then overlay this idea of either incremental or radical innovation. And there's degrees in between. So incremental being smaller steps and radical being bigger steps. So when I talk about degrees of innovation, or when that's discussed, in actual fact, we're just talking about the size of the steps that are being taken. So incremental might be small steps that look like that, whereas radical might be much bigger steps. And this has quite a dramatic implication in the conversation around disruption, because elsewhere we'll talk about this notion of disruption, the disruption theory that was put forward by Clayton Christensen, where he points out that we can make the mistake of thinking that we are innovating in an appropriate way. We actually, for example, because we decide that we need to be braver, we need to take bigger bets, and therefore we switch from being incremental in terms of our innovation attitude to being more radical. But the point that gets made in disruption theory is that we still are innovating on the same trajectory. And an example of this would be if we made the assumption that we would keep optimizing the existing format of a smartphone, for example. So the mobile phone has evolved up a particular trajectory, and every now and again it's taken quite radical leaps where things have been changed about the way in which it functions and so on. But for the most part, the gadget is still pretty much in the form that it has been for quite a long time, pretty much since its inception. It might have got smaller, slimmer, etc. It's, the sizes has varied, the weight has varied, and the functionality has obviously changed. But in essence, it's on the same trajectory. It's still a gadget that's intended to communicate, to allow people to interact with each other and with the environment around them and so on. So we'll come back to that when we talk about disruption theory. But for the moment, when we talk about degrees, what I'd like you to just keep in mind is this idea that this is incremental and that is radical, and we can have both of those going on, but on a particular trajectory. And the question we must ask ourselves is, even though we are being brave by being radical, are we making sure that we're taking these big bets on the right trajectory of innovation? Okay, now, that kind of leads us into this idea of the dimensions of innovation, because that's where we are asking ourselves, where are we actually innovating in the organization? And in order to understand that, we can look at it in this particular way. So what is it that we are trying to achieve? What's the outcome that we are looking for? Well, the outcome, in essence, is, as I mentioned before, new and durable value. And let's put that in a box like that just for the moment. That's what we are trying to achieve. And then the question is, what are the dimensions of innovation that we could look at in order to achieve that outcome? And here we have a number of different possibilities. The traditional possibilities are product. Going back to the mobile phone, the product would be the phone itself, the actual physical gadget. So that's one dimension, and we can hook that up in that way. Another dimension, which is traditionally very visible, is service innovations. So if you were a car phone warehouse, for example, the product sits on the shelf, but actually having customers feel comfortable with phoning into car phone warehouse and asking questions about their account and how to set up the phone and so on, or bringing the phone in and asking for that kind of input, or dealing with a service failure or a product failure through a service intervention. Those are all about the dimension of service. And then there are a number of others which are slightly different and maybe not so obvious for the most part. And I'd like to choose process first. And process we could actually divide up into a number of different possibilities, but one would be so-called business processes, and another would be, if we were a manufacturer, manufacturing processes, just for the sake of completeness. But processes are things we could actually, it's a dimension of innovation that we could actually work on. The other that's a slightly more recent element of discussion around dimensions of innovation, and which is very prevalent at the moment, is this notion of business model innovation. So yet another dimension that we can have a look at. The business model is in essence the recipe that helps us to deliver the strategy of the organization. So it sets up the way in which we create the value, it sets up the way in which we capture the value, and it translates that from the strategy into the revenue vertical. So if I talk again about Steve Jobs working at Apple and what is the thing that he brings to the party or brought to the party at Apple, according to some of his biggest proponents, they talked about the fact that he had this ability to convert ideas into actual revenue, into actual products and services that customers wanted. Well, one vehicle to get those conversions from ideas into actual revenue verticals is via an understanding of business models that are creating the value and capturing the value in a way that's appropriate to both the value proposition and, more importantly, to the customer. And then the last piece, as far as this is concerned, which is also pertinent really to Apple, is to talk about the platform. This is something that has been spoken about in a book that was published last year, 2013, by somebody called James McQuivey, who wrote a book called Digital Disruption. And then more recently, so into 2014 in the news, there's been this discussion about whether Apple is a product company or a platform company. So if you think about Amazon, for example, is Amazon a platform company or a product company? And perhaps Jeff Bezos from Amazon would say, well, actually they are both, and in which case you need to understand what the balance is and how you deal with those different types of business. But the platform notion, in the case of Apple, would be, how would you categorize the iPod, the iPad, the MacBook, as opposed to, for example, iTunes as a platform or as a kind of service wraparound? So the system that underlies what they are trying to do. And then, of course, as we move into things that are more to do with taking advantage of the data that's getting generated around the world, of course, the platform becomes more important. Okay, so these are the various different dimensions, and I'm going to just box them off just so that we have a clear picture of what we are looking at. And then the last piece here is to have a look at the input elements, and these inputs is, in summary, really the business. I like to call it infrastructure. So what is the business infrastructure required in order to be able to deliver across these different dimensions? So if I was to put a couple of arrows just indicative of the relationships here, we have the inputs and the outcomes, and in between the dimensions. And in this box down here, the business infrastructure, this is, for example, if I'm newly recruited into your business, who do I talk to in order to take an idea through the process that the organization has? Where do I find that process? Which ideas are the right ideas? How do I find out what's required to be done? Where do I get resources from? All of those questions are to do with the fact that there is in place the processes, the resources, the understanding, etc., to be able to deliver on that. And I would call that business infrastructure. So the inputs, what is it that we need in order to be able to facilitate those inputs?